Hello, I'm Guy Hansen, Director of Exhibitions at the National Library of Australia. Today I'm going to be talking to Dr. Philip Jones about our new exhibition, Illustrating the Antipodes, George French Angus in Australia and New Zealand. I'm really looking forward to hearing about this show, Philip.
Great to be here.
So this show's all about George French Angus, the artist. Can you tell me what he did and why he's a figure we should be interested in?
He was an extraordinary young man, highly talented and precocious, not prepared to go into his father's business and wanting to travel the world as a naturalist and an artist. And he was able to do that. He was a romantic, but also a highly skilled, disciplined natural history illustrator. And he somehow managed to combine these two elements.
So he spent 2 years travelling the world, producing amazing sketches and art, which has now ended up in the collections of the National Library and the South Australian Museum. And you've had the great pleasure of going through these collections and curating a great show for us.
Well, it's been a detective story, I suppose, lasting for nearly a couple of decades.
So what were the years that he was travelling?
He set off in late 1843 from London, arrived in South Australia on the 1st of January 1844 and spent the next 18 months in Australia and New Zealand before returning to a huge exhibition of his work, 300 watercolours.
So all of these pictures which he produced over this time, they sort of give us a snapshot of what was happening in Australia and New Zealand and on the frontier and as settlement was ongoing. So it's an invaluable resource.
It is. He was very aware of his place in history, and he called it the tide of history he knew would be sweeping over these distant colonies. And his intent was to capture what was shortly going to be irrevocably altered by European colonisation.
And what are these two key works which you've got at the front of the exhibition? What are they?
Well, these are the title pages to his 2 volumes of lithographs, hand-coloured lithographs, which were published, both of them within a few months of his return to England in 1846. South Australia Illustrated, 60 lithographs contained in that volume, and the New Zealanders Illustrated, which came out in the same year.
And so the exhibition has some of the original sketches and drawings and watercolours, as well as some of the lithographs from these books.
Yes, indeed. The watercolours that he made were made purely in order to essentially market the lithograph volumes, and were forgotten for many years because people turned their attention to the lithographs, and the watercolours stayed in collections and were generally not seen for 175 years.
Let's go and explore some of these works. So Philip, Angus was clearly a very talented artist, and I gather he was quite a child prodigy. Can you tell me a bit about his education and how he acquired his skills?
Well, in the early years he was entirely self-taught as a young boy, and he was known for drawing on the walls of his bedroom. But soon after that he began, you could say, his career essentially as a copyist initially, and highly skilled at reproducing birds and insects and plants, really from the age of 8 or 9. And then after 3 or 4 years, I believe he really began to see his future in terms of publishing. He was taking his model perhaps from people like Edward Lear. He was looking at the subscription method of publishing. And so in 1838, a year after Queen Victoria ascended the throne, he founded a little magazine when he was 16 years old with his own illustrations and journalism in it.
So I can see that we've got some great examples of his early work here. I can see a school book, clearly a very good student, and we can also see some of these early publications which I gather he sold to relatives and friends.
Yes, he began this little magazine, the Victoria magazine. He offered them by subscription for a penny or twopence a month, and then the idea was that you pass it on to the next person. And this was to his relatives and friends. He was age 16 at this time, so you can detect an entrepreneurial spirit.
Did he just do one edition, and that was what was circulated, or more than one edition?
Yeah, he did one edition. We're very lucky to have 3 of them that still exist. There are 2 in the National Library collection. And they combine his copyist skills, which you see, to very good effect. But his school book is an extraordinary document because you can see in there that he's already, at the age of 16, conversant with the principles of light and physics and perspective. And he was extremely good at employing or deploying those skills in his work later.
Did he have an unconventional education at the time?
He had a nonconformist education. He was from a family of dissenters, and the idea was that if you made money, you needed to push it back into the society and the community. And he was imbued with those ideals as well.
So, Philip, Angus came out to Australia and New Zealand and also spent a lot of time in South Australia in particular. What was the reason that he came to this part of the world?
Well, he was poised to embark on a career as an artist, but he didn't particularly have a subject until we bring in his father to the story. His father was the chair of the South Australia Company, the new colony that had been founded in 1836. And in the early 1840s, his father actually purchased what is largely the Barossa Valley today. And he needed to promote the valley to investors and those who would be interested in coming to South Australia. And the idea that his son would become an artist was anathema to him at that time. But then he saw maybe it's a good idea to bring him to South Australia and he can do pictures of the Barossa Valley and so on and promote the colony.
And we've got a couple of sketches, drawings from the Barossa just here.
Yes, well, this is an extraordinary image. It's the only image that exists of the small German township of Bethany on the edge of the Barossa Valley. The beauty of the National Library's collection is that we have the sketch or sketches for these images. And here you see, for example, a milkmaid, you could call her that, and some figures sitting on a log here. And here's the sketch for those individuals. And this is what Angus did. He did figure studies separately, and then he did the landscape, and then inserted the figures into that picture. So we see that very nicely in these 2 images.
And this is the kind of detective work that you've been able to do working with the library's archives, is you've been able to find the original studies and then how he's recombined those elements into finished illustrations. And
hopefully also revisiting those sites and seeing, yes, he did actually stand there in January 1844 and do that image.
So it's a really important record of what South Australia was like in this period.
Well, yes, because of the detail. And there were more impressionistic images, people who were not necessarily trained in art, but Angus had this training. And he had, in a sense, a photographic sensibility for the landscape.
So we've got a whole set of drawings and watercolours and things from the Barossa in the show for people to look at.
We do, because this was his primary obligation to his father, which he more or less completed in the first month or 2 of being in South Australia. And then he moved to various expeditions, journeys into the bush, as he called it. And there are 4 of those, and we look at all of those in the exhibition.
So, Philip, the accuracy of his depictions of the frontier, of course, included some really beautiful and sympathetic drawings of Indigenous people, and we've got some here.
And what you can see in these images is essentially the balance that he was able to maintain between his sort of leanings towards romanticism and his absolutely austere depiction of detail. And I think you see that in this little image of Rimili Peringari, who was a young boy whom he encountered with his mother on the banks of the Murray at Wellington, southeast of Adelaide, and wearing a little duckbill pendant. And these are details which no other ethnographer was recording at the time. He also wasn't averse to including images of the impact of Europeans, and so you see a blanket here and probably a sailor's jersey in the top image there.
So we can see that Angus is sort of drawing what he's seeing. He's not sort of making things up. There's good evidence to suggest these are very accurate drawings.
Yeah. I would maintain that he didn't draw anything that he couldn't see. In other words, he's not adding in. Occasionally in his landscapes he leaves a space in the foreground for figures, but these are figures that he's seen. Yeah.
So the documentary nature of Angus's illustrations, I think, really comes out in this piece. You can see how accurate and how much attention to detail. What are we looking at here?
Well, here we're looking at a compilation from his different expeditions in South Australia generally, although he also included a few objects which were lent to him by Governor Gray, who was really his sponsor in South Australia. So there's a little Kimberley Point from northwestern Australia and one or two other items. But generally he's recording items which other ethnographers had not noticed in this period. So for example, a wickerwork snare, if you like, or somewhere where birds would rest and then they'd be hooked off with a device which he's recorded down here. A whole range of material culture objects. And the interesting thing now is that Narranyuri descendants are looking at these objects as inspiration for reviving material culture in their region because of the accuracy of these works.
So some of the other ethnographers, when you see their assemblages, it's often heavily focused on weapons, but you can see baskets and other devices here.
Yes, yeah, items of domestic use. And if you look at these tiny little vignettes, he's recording Narranyuri women fishing on the Lake Albert, using a floating island of reeds to dive off and collect mussels. And nobody else recorded this. Yeah. So these sorts of things are really vital.
It's this beautiful couple of drawings. Angus, of course, had been very interested in natural history when he was younger. And of course, during these expeditions, he did a lot of natural history drawing. And we've got some great examples here. Can you tell me a bit about this beautiful piece here, and then this slightly awkward-looking kangaroo here?
Well, here you see his finished work, and actually this is a lithograph of his entomology of South Australia. So to gain those pictures, he collected the specimens himself, but he also relied on colleagues who were already forming a reputation in Adelaide in the early 1840s for their entomology. So he was always using these networks of individuals, and from that he was able to make these extraordinary drawings which stood the test of time, and they're still used as a reference today. Whereas this one is a field sketch, and it was made during his third expedition with Governor Gray. And Gray, a few months earlier, had actually discovered for Western science this particular species of kangaroo, which is now extinct. It was named for him, Halmataurus grayi. And on the third expedition, they found or discovered more specimens of this kangaroo. And this is the one that ended up in the British Museum. But this is Angus's sketch in the field where he's created the measurements, tail length, hind and forepaws, ears, the whole thing.
And when you say specimen, you most probably mean the kangaroo's dead when it's being drawn.
Yes, yes. I mean, what they commented on is it's extremely agile and fast. And you had to be very lucky to bring one down with the weaponry, the hunting weaponry of that time. It's inscribed on the image, April 19th, 1844. It was during the third expedition with Governor Gray. Gray had the year before actually secured a specimen of the kangaroo, and from that the kangaroo was named Halmataurus grayi, named after Gray. But on this expedition, they were able to bring to ground this particular female of the species, and from that dead animal, Angus was able to draw this image with all the measurements which are scientifically so important for differentiating species. and 100 years later, this animal is extinct. So these records are extremely significant and important scientifically.
Yeah, no, it's obviously a really important record of things which are gone now, and it really kind of captures that moment that Angus was there where Australia was changing so much.
Yes, and his eye for colour is so important here. He's captured all of the nuances of the animal's fur, for which it was known widely. It was, and one of the reasons for it going extinct was this very attractive fur.
So, Philip, we talked about South Australia and the extensive work that Angus did there, but New Zealand was another focus of his interest. And so can you tell me about his travels in New Zealand?
Yeah. In July 1844, he received a letter from his father saying, well, you've done enough, come home. And Angus was just in the grip of his project, and he didn't want to go home, but he didn't know how to evade his father's reach, if you like. And so he heard about this incredible place over the water where there was this remarkable architecture and material culture and people in New Zealand, Maori people. So he managed to jump on a South Australia Company ship which was going there. And from there on, he had introductions from the governor, George Grey, to various officials and individuals in New Zealand. And he was able to set off on a tour with the protector of Aborigines, as it was called in New Zealand, Thomas Forsyth, who actually spoke fluent Maori. And they went from mission to mission by foot. One of the objectives was to discuss issues which had arisen from the Treaty of Waitangi, which had just been a few years earlier, 4 years earlier. So Angus was then meeting all of the Raratangi, or the chiefs of the Maori, who were very pleased to have their portraits taken because they knew that Angus would be taking them over the seas to Queen Victoria. And they, at this particular juncture, felt that they needed more authority on their side to win the arguments with the New Zealand government, if you like, in that period.
So I can see that, like the portraits we've got here, they're not just exotic figures, they're real people, and you can even see the signatures of the people who've been depicted.
Yeah, we're at this particular moment in history where Maori are embracing literacy. They're seeing Christianity as a means of entering the European sphere on their own terms. And literacy is certainly part of that. So a lot of these significant political figures, the Raratangi, the chiefs, were already literate and were prepared to sign their own portraits, almost as an endorsement. This is me, and I am the chief of so-and-so and so-and-so. So Angus is asking them to do this, and they're posing for him, knowing that these pictures are going to reach England. So they're dressing in their finery. And what you're seeing are these extraordinary records that Angus is making so faithfully of the decoration and the material of these flax cloaks at this juncture.
Yeah, they really are quite extraordinary, and you can really see the details of the cloaks and the care that Angus has taken to record the individuals' names and the settings. So again, really important documentary material about the history of New Zealand.
And this image, or both of them, are particularly interesting because these children here are the children of Te Pakaru, who was one of the key figures in the north of the North Island of New Zealand in the early 1840s. And these two men are signatories of the Treaty of Waitangi. I was able to visit this locality and almost by chance meet the great-great-great-great-grandson of Te Pakaru, who had never seen this particular picture. He was familiar with this one because it was published as a lithograph, but he was very touched to see that this existed. Angus would have been touched as well, I think.
Yeah, fantastic story. So, Philip, in these set of drawings and illustrations of New Zealand, there's some amazing depictions of Maori carving. Can you tell me a little bit about these images here?
Well, these were made during his journey north from Lake Taupo, which is in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand, north back to Auckland. You know, I think these images give us an image of what separated Angus from other artists of this period, who would have been intimidated by something as complex and finely drawn and finely carved and detailed as this, which is a monument erected by one of the key rangatira or chiefs in the North Island to his favourite daughter who had passed away. And he'd commissioned it from an old man who was a renowned carver who was simply using a single old bayonet, a British bayonet, to make this incredible carving with pearl shell eyes on all the figures. And this fellow was still alive and living in the village when Angus came through and made this drawing. Angus had the opportunity to show the drawing to the old man, who was overwhelmed. He said, "You are a great priest," he said, in Maori to Angus. This is the sort of thing that Angus was able to rattle together pretty quickly and astonished everyone by this degree of accuracy and skill. And you see it here in this carving of a tiki. He had permission by the chiefs to do this, and once they realised his levels of skill, they were very happy for him to take these images back to England.
And do these structures survive today?
No, they don't. And Angus was aware. He was seeing the damage that had been wrought by colonisation, the fact that traditions were falling away. And he knew that these structures would not last much longer, and they didn't. However, Maori people are reviving these skills today and have been hanging on to those traditions in the intervening period. But nowadays, these images are becoming more and more significant for people who are looking to recreate what their ancestors had made.
So, Philip, one of the places where Angus did spend some time was Sydney, and here you can see some illustrations which looks like they're fairly, you know, the kind of idea of Sydney and the heads. What are we looking at here?
Well, after he finished his work in South Australia, he knew that he had to do two things. Firstly, assemble all his work and have exhibitions of his work, both in Adelaide and Sydney. So he moved across to Sydney in July, August 1845, and he made a number of drawings in Sydney and also south of Sydney around Kiama. And here in Sydney you can see his black and white or ink and wash sketches of the La Perouse monument, which of course is still standing at Botany Bay, a well-known monument in memory of the French explorer La Perouse. And then below, and these were made just a few days before he left Australia for London, you can see his image of the heads and what he called the parting ship, the ship on its way from, not his ship, but another ship on its way from Australia back to London. And interestingly, 10 years later, Angus was actually living not far from this vantage point as the secretary of the Australian Museum in Sydney.
You can sort of see he's got a bit of an eye for the market, though, in the production of these sketches. These are sort of things, sort of images that people might want to have.
Yeah, and these were turned into small lithographs, which were published in his the record of his journal of his time in the Antipodes. And these featured in that. So they've only just come to light, actually, just before the exhibition. So we're very lucky to have them in there.
More of your great detective work, Philip. So Philip, in 1845, when Angus started his journey back home, he was only 23 and he'd had an amazing couple of years. So after you've had the great pleasure of going through all of this material, what do you think is the kind of legacy of Angus from this amazing 2 years of his life?
Well, he was able to return to London, where he had already, or his father had probably booked the Egyptian Hall, which was the premier exhibition venue in London. And so his show was held there with more than 300 of his finished watercolours on display, together with specimens of natural history and ethnographic material. And that would have been a transitory experience were it not for the fact that he produced these two marvellous volumes, one South Australia Illustrated, one New Zealanders Illustrated. And for that he had to subject his own watercolours to the lithographic process. And here you can see the transition from his original watercolour, and this is of one of the sinkholes in the volcanic region of southeastern South Australia, where they came across these remarkable landforms that they'd not seen before. And this is Angus's image of what was known then as the Devil's Punch Bowl. And you can see Angus himself as the artist sitting on the edge of the punch bowl. You can see some figures in the background as well. But when it came to making the lithograph, the lithographers and probably Angus himself decided that some of these images needed simplifying. They were a little too complex. So what you see here is the figures have been taken out and kangaroos have been substituted. Also, the vegetation has altered a little. So the recognisable vegetation that Angus was drawing very accurately is, unfortunately, in the lithographs, is occasionally overcome or superseded by the lithographer's version of what the vegetation should look like. So one of the satisfying aspects of this show has been to go back to those original sketches or original watercolours and to see the difference between the original watercolour and the lithograph. The lithography was at a very high level, very high standard, and Angus was certainly happy with the result. And he has been known primarily for those lithographs. So once again, this exhibition and the book that accompanies it takes us back to the field, to the way in which the images were made, and we can measure the effect of his lithographs and the original watercolours.
Well, thanks for that, Philip. It's amazing to hear about these wonderful illustrations produced by Angus in the 1840s. If you'd like to see this beautiful exhibition, it's on now at the National Library of Australia. I hope you can come in.